The morning sun bathed the Callahan estate in golden light, glinting off the glass walls of the mansion perched in the hills above San Francisco. From the outside, it looked like a dream carved into the edge of the world. Richard Callahan, tech mogul and visionary founder of Synapse Technologies, was a man who, by all societal metrics, had won. He was rich beyond measure, influential in circles that dictated the future, and respected, even envied, by those who read about him in Forbes and Bloomberg. But the heart of his empire and of his life was not housed in data centers or boardrooms. It was a 7-year-old girl named Emily, with her mother having passed away shortly after her birth. Emily was a quiet but constant star in Richard's orbit, the only thing that ever pulled him away from his relentless work schedule. He didn't always understand her, didn't always know how to comfort her when she cried at night, but he tried, and in trying he became softer. To help with the demands of parenting and his global business, Richard hired a live-in nanny. Sarah Green was not the kind of woman who turned heads at cocktail parties. In her mid-20s, with gentle features and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper, Sarah came from a modest upbringing in Oregon. She had no connections, no family legacy, no LinkedIn page full of powerful acquaintances. What she did have was warmth and a quiet competence that made Emily feel safe. Sarah moved through the mansion like a shadow, tending to Emily with the steady grace of someone who knew how to be present without intruding. She never sought to impress, never interrupted Richard's meetings, never asked for more than what was offered. For all her humility, Emily adored her. She would reach for Sarah's hand instead of her father's during thunderstorms. She laughed more when Sarah was around. Richard noticed, but he didn't dwell on it. He told himself it was natural. Children bonded with caregivers. It was a transactional arrangement. Important, yes, but ultimately professional. Sarah was paid well. She had a room with a view of the garden, her own bathroom, and time off every Sunday. That was enough, wasn't it? Everything in Richard's life was built on control. Budgets balanced. Plans executed. People managed. There were no surprises. No chaos. And no space for complications that could not be filed into spreadsheets or solved by algorithms. Until the day chaos knocked on the front door dressed in pink balloons and birthday banners. It was Emily's birthday. The estate had been transformed for the occasion. Caterers setting up gourmet snacks, entertainers in coordinated uniforms, and dozens of children from elite prep schools laughing in the backyard under a rented carousel. Richard, though uncomfortable with spectacle, allowed it for her sake. She deserved joy, normalcy. Sarah remained close to Emily, kneeling beside her during games, adjusting her hair, reminding her to stay hydrated under the sun. Richard watched from a distance, taking a business call from the balcony overlooking the garden. He spoke of acquisitions and data analytics, barely hearing the laughter below, until the laughter stopped. It happened so fast it barely registered. One moment, Emily was holding a slice of cake. The next, the plate crashed to the ground, and she followed. Her knees buckled. Her tiny frame hit the grass with a soft thud that felt louder than a thunderclap. Screams erupted. The music died. And in the sudden stillness, Sarah's voice rang out, calm but firm. "Someone call an ambulance." Richard's phone slipped from his hand. He raced down the stairs, the world narrowing into tunnel vision. By the time he reached Emily, she was barely conscious. Her face pale, lips trembling, eyes fluttering. The paramedics arrived within minutes. Emily was lifted onto a stretcher, tubes and wires quickly attached. A medic turned to Richard. "She's exhibiting signs of acute internal trauma, possibly autoimmune related. We need to get her to the hospital immediately." Richard barely heard the words. He followed the ambulance, heart pounding like a drum, his vision blurring with images of Emily's fragile body on that stretcher. At the hospital, he was asked to wait in a private room as doctors worked on stabilizing her. The minutes crawled by like hours. Then a nurse entered, face tight with urgency. "She needs a blood transfusion," she said. "It's critical, but her blood type is very rare. None of the samples on hand are compatible." Richard's mind raced. "Test me." They did. He wasn't a match. Nor were the other family members they called. Time was running out. And then in the hallway, a quiet voice spoke up. "I'll do it." It was Sarah. The nurse blinked. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Sarah nodded. "Just please don't tell anyone." She was taken to the donation room. No fuss, no hesitation, no requests, just a silent resolve of someone who understood the value of a single life and was willing to bleed for it. Emily was saved that day. Richard never knew why. Not yet. The white walls of St. Augustine Medical Center seemed to hum with tension. Richard sat in a stiff chair outside the ICU, hands clenched, staring at the floor as if it could offer answers. Nurses moved past him quickly, their shoes squeaking softly against the polished tiles, their voices hushed but determined. Occasionally, a door would swing open and reveal a blur of motion inside Emily's room. Doctors adjusting equipment, nurses checking vitals, machines beeping in steady rhythm. No one had spoken to him for almost half an hour. He was used to controlling environments, manipulating systems, streamlining processes until results were inevitable. But here, in this sterile corridor, none of his resources mattered. He had money, influence, reach, but none of those things could manufacture blood, not the kind his daughter needed. He replayed the last thing the nurse had said. Her blood type was rare, extremely rare, O negative, universal donor, but not universal recipient. There were no compatible family members, none in the blood bank. Time wasn't just running out, it was disappearing. Then the nurse returned. Her face was calmer now. "We've found a donor," she said. Richard's head snapped up. "Who?" "I'm sorry, sir. They requested anonymity." He blinked. "Anonymity? That's absurd. My daughter isn't there. I deserve to know who's donating." The nurse didn't flinch. "You'll be informed if the donor consents. For now, you should know that she's receiving the transfusion. Her vitals are improving. She's stable for now." He barely registered the pronoun. He should have. It was a hint, a sliver of truth accidentally dropped. But his mind was spinning too fast, caught between relief and frustration. Sarah sat in another wing of the hospital, her arm bandaged, a slight tinge of fatigue beneath her eyes. The nurse who had drawn her blood offered her juice, which she accepted quietly. She never asked about Emily's condition. She had heard enough through the hallway chatter. She knew the girl would be fine now. That was all she needed. When she returned to the mansion that night, it was past midnight. No one else had come back yet. The house was eerily quiet, the event decorations still partially hanging in the backyard, twisted by the wind into lifeless shapes. She slipped into her room without turning on the lights, pulled off her shoes, and lay on the bed, fully clothed. Her arm throbbed a little. Her body ached, but her mind was quiet. She didn't tell anyone what she had done. She never intended to. The following day, Richard returned home with Emily, who was still groggy but stable. She would remain under observation for a few days, but had responded well to the transfusion. The doctors attributed her recovery to a combination of quick medical intervention and an incredibly well-timed donation. Sarah was already back to her duties. She prepared soup. She cleaned up the remnants of the birthday party. She folded clothes and organized Emily's medication schedule. When Richard walked in with Emily in his arms, Sarah looked up briefly, offered a soft smile, and resumed setting the table for dinner. He paused. "You're here," he said, more as an observation than a greeting. "I never left," she replied. That night, Emily clung to Sarah's side while they read books in her room. She didn't say much, but her tiny fingers gripped Sarah's hand tighter than usual. Richard stood just outside the door, watching silently. The image unsettled him in ways he didn't understand. He chalked it up to stress, fatigue, the echo of nearly losing everything. But something in his daughter's eyes, something in the way she looked at Sarah now, was different. Over the next week, life settled into something that resembled normalcy. Emily was back to her routines, though a little weaker, a little quieter. Richard's meetings resumed. Calls flowed in from investors, board members, even reporters who had caught wind of the incident at the party. He offered polite, corporate responses. "She's recovering well. Thank you for your concern." But something lingered. Late one evening, Emily had fallen asleep in Sarah's lap while they watched an old animated film in the media room. Richard walked in just as Sarah was about to carry her upstairs. "I can take her," he offered. Sarah shook her head gently. "She's already comfortable." He hesitated. "She really seems attached to you lately." Sarah didn't look up. Children remember kindness, especially when they're scared. There was something final in her tone, something he couldn't quite argue with. That night, as he poured himself a drink in the study, he couldn't stop thinking about the mystery donor, the anonymous savior who had appeared in the hospital like a ghost and vanished again without fanfare. It made no sense. In his world, favors came with names and receipts. People didn't just give without taking, especially something so personal, so valuable. He opened his laptop and began sending emails to the hospital staff. Polite at first, then more insistent. He wanted answers, names. He wanted to know who had saved his daughter. He told himself it was gratitude, but part of it was pride. Across the hall, Sarah placed a hand on Emily's forehead, checked her temperature, and whispered a lullaby her mother had once sung to her as a child. The room was dark except the glow of a nightlight shaped like a moon. She sat in the armchair until Emily's breathing steadied, then rose quietly and stepped out, nearly bumping into Richard. He looked surprised to see her. "I was just checking on her," she said softly. "I know." He didn't move. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Richard asked, "Were you at the hospital the whole time? After?" She nodded. "I stayed until she was cleared for discharge. I didn't see you. I didn't want to be seen." He tilted his head. "Why?" "She needed you more than she needed me then." He didn't reply. That night, he returned to his study and stared at the list of blood donors he had received from a reluctant hospital administrator. It was coded, names anonymized. But one entry stood out. Female, late 20s, O negative, live-in domestic staff, donation timestamp within 20 minutes of arrival. His eyes narrowed. He looked at the timestamp again. He looked at Sarah's shift logs. And then it clicked. He didn't say anything. Not yet, but something in his perception of her shifted. She had saved Emily. She hadn't told him. And for reasons he couldn't yet define, that fact shook him more than anything else had in years. 2 days after his late-night realization, Richard found himself unusually distracted. Board meetings blurred. Emails went unanswered longer than usual. In video calls with department heads, he caught himself glancing at the corner of the screen, lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with market share or Q4 projections. He knew it was Sarah, not just her gesture, although that alone would have been enough to alter his perspective, but her refusal to speak of it. The world he inhabited was built on transparency of leverage. Everything had a price, every favor a trade. Yet she had given something precious, walked away from recognition, and returned to folding laundry as if the most profound moment of his life had not included her at all. One morning, he passed by the kitchen just in time to see Sarah tying Emily's shoelaces. His daughter sat on the counter, giggling as Sarah made up a song about left feet and right socks. There was light in Emily's face again, something fragile but unmistakable. The sight stopped him cold. When Sarah noticed him watching, she nodded politely. Nothing in her eyes hinted at discomfort. No shift in posture. No deflection. Only quiet acknowledgement. "Morning," he said, clearing his throat. "Good morning," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's forehead. Later that day, he called Dr. Anders, the attending physician from Emily's emergency care team. The man was hesitant at first, citing confidentiality agreements and donor protection protocols. Richard cut in. "Doctor, I'm not asking for the names of 100 random donors. I'm asking you to confirm one name. Just one. You and I both know who she is." There was a long silence. "You're asking me to betray the trust of someone who insisted on silence," Dr. Anders finally said. "I don't think you fully understand the kind of person you're dealing with, Mr. Callahan. She didn't want thanks. She didn't want recognition. She just wanted your daughter to live." "I'm aware." "No, I don't think you are." That statement lingered long after the call ended. That evening, as the house quieted down and Emily fell asleep curled beside her favorite stuffed penguin, Richard sat on the patio outside his study. The air was cool, the city lights stretching like veins beneath the hills. He nursed a glass of wine, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the years he had spent building walls, between himself and emotion, between wealth and vulnerability, between employer and employee. And yet Sarah had slipped past them all. She had become part of his daughter's universe without fanfare, had inserted herself into the very fabric of their lives, not by force, not even by design, but through something rarer, presence. He remembered something his mother used to say when he was a boy. Real strength is quiet. You don't need to shout when you're certain. At the time, he had scoffed at it. In Silicon Valley, strength was pitch decks and press coverage. But now, looking at Sarah's closed bedroom window across the courtyard, he began to understand. The next morning, he asked his assistant to cancel 2 meetings. Instead, he sat with Emily while she ate breakfast. It wasn't something he usually did. She noticed immediately. "Are you sick?" she asked with wide eyes. "No," he chuckled. "I just missed you." She beamed, swinging her legs under the table. "Missed you too. Sarah's been taking really good care of you, huh?" "She always does," Emily replied, spooning cereal into her mouth. Richard hesitated. "Did she ever say anything to you about the hospital?" Emily tilted her head. "Like what?" "Anything. About that day. About what happened." His daughter was quiet for a moment. Then she looked down and whispered. "She told me not to be scared, that she was going to help me." Richard leaned forward slightly. "She said that?" "Yeah. She held my hand and told me I'd be okay. And then, I think she gave me her blood." Richard's breath caught. "She told you that?" "No." Emily shrugged. "I just know." There was again that certainty children have, unshaped by doubt or politics. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't a theory. Emily knew because she had felt it. That evening, after Sarah had finished cleaning the upstairs hallway, Richard waited by the staircase. "Can we talk?" he asked. She looked at him, surprised. "Of course." They walked to the conservatory, a glass enclosure filled with tropical plants and a small koi pond. It was one of the few places in the house that didn't feel like a conference room. He gestured for her to sit. "I know," he began, "about the hospital." She didn't flinch. "I know you were the donor." Still no reaction. "I saw the timestamps. I spoke to the doctors." He paused, unsure what to say next. I don't understand why you didn't say anything." Sarah looked at him, her expression calm. "Because it wasn't about me. But you saved her. You saved my daughter. Do you know what that means?" "Yes," she said simply. "It means she gets to grow up." Her words landed like stones in water, sending ripples through everything he thought he knew about sacrifice. "I would have done anything to save her," he said, voice low. "I know," she replied. "That's why I didn't tell you. You need more guilt." He stared at her. "I didn't do it to be thanked or rewarded. I did it because Emily matters. Because she's good and kind and deserves a future. I didn't want to complicate that with awkwardness or gratitude you'd feel obligated to express." "You should have told me," he said, softer now. "And then what?" she asked. "Would I still be here, folding her socks? Or would everything between us change into something transactional?" That question hung between them like fog. He didn't answer it. Instead, he said, "You're not invisible. I want you to know that." "I never want to be seen," she said. "I just wanted her to be okay." They sat in silence for a long time. Then Richard said something that surprised even himself. "I'm grateful." She looked at him. "I know," she said. Then she rose, gave a gentle nod, and walked out of the conservatory, leaving him there with the echo of humility and the weight of unspoken truths. It began with a whisper, one that slipped between the cracks of a half-sleeping child's voice. "She saved me." Richard heard it one night as he walked past Emily's room. The door was slightly ajar, a nightlight glowing from the corner, casting slow-moving shadows along the wall. Sarah was curled on the edge of the bed, reading softly, her voice like a calming rhythm. Emily, half asleep but lucid enough to speak, turned to her and whispered, "She saved me." The words pierced him with more force than he expected. He didn't interrupt. He stood silently for a few seconds, retreating before they could see him, his mind suddenly restless with questions he had thought were settled. Days passed, and though nothing appeared unusual on the surface, Richard became increasingly fixated on small details, subtle, almost imperceptible changes in Emily's behavior. She was already close to Sarah before the incident, but now there was something deeper, more instinctive. She sought her out not just for comfort, but for a sense of safety, a wordless confidence that Sarah could make anything better. During breakfast, if Sarah entered the room, Emily's eyes followed her. When she laughed, she looked to Sarah first, almost as if seeking her approval. When Richard came home late, Emily would greet him, but only after asking where Sarah was. It was subtle, never dramatic, but consistent. One Saturday morning, Richard took Emily to the park alone. It was something they rarely did without Sarah, but he wanted time with her, real, uninterrupted time. They played near the pond, fed ducks, and sat on a bench eating ice cream. She was cheerful, but at one point she said, "Can we take some back for Sarah?" Richard smiled. "Of course, but you know, she's not always going to be your nanny. Someday she'll move on." Emily looked confused. Why would she leave? Well, he said carefully, because people grow, and sometimes they go on to do other things. Maybe she'll go to school again or find a new job. His daughter was silent for a long moment. "She doesn't need to go anywhere," she said softly. "This is her home, too." That evening, Richard stood at his office window, overlooking the garden where Sarah was helping Emily water the plants. He watched as they moved between the flower beds, Emily holding the hose with both hands, Sarah gently guiding her so she didn't soak the rose bushes. They laughed together. Genuine laughter, the kind that didn't require effort or rehearsal. And for the first time, Richard felt like an outsider in his own home. He told himself he wasn't jealous. That would be absurd. But what he felt was undeniably close to displacement. Sarah had entered their lives through the back door, and without ever demanding space, had quietly become central. And now that he knew what she had done for his daughter, what she had given without expectation, he couldn't stop noticing the weight of her presence. That night, he sat at his desk long after everyone had gone to bed. The house was dark and still. On his laptop, he pulled up Sarah's employment records. They were sparse. A simple resume, references from a local preschool, and a family she had previously worked for. Standard background checks. All clean. He opened a search engine and began looking deeper. There was no social media presence beyond a dormant account from years ago. No college alumni network participation. No local articles or online mentions. It was as if she had made a quiet decision to exist off the radar. He found one thing, a local news report from 5 years prior, a photo of a car accident in Portland. Her name was listed among the injured, though the article said little else. He filed away in his mind, unsure if it mattered, but unwilling to ignore it. The next morning, he called a private investigator. It wasn't an act of malice. He told himself it was curiosity, concern, perhaps even gratitude. He needed to understand the full picture. He needed to know who she was, not just a woman who had saved his daughter, but the person beneath the silence. Within 48 hours, he had a file on his desk. The content surprised him. Sarah had dropped out of college midway through her degree, citing financial hardship. Her mother had been diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's around the same time. Since then, Sarah had been working multiple part-time jobs, nannying, retail, sometimes night shifts at a grocery store, to send money back home. She had no siblings, no savings, no notable relationships. Her life was structured around quiet survival. Richard closed the folder slowly. For a man whose world was defined by leverage, this felt like a foreign language. She had no angle, no play, just a life of constant giving, without fanfare or expectation. And for the first time, Richard began to realize just how insulated he had been. Surrounded by people who took, who maneuvered, who negotiated, Sarah had simply served. He didn't speak to her about it. Not yet, but the knowledge weighed on him. He found himself watching her more closely, noticing things he'd ignored before. The slight limp in her step when she climbed the stairs too quickly, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when she carried heavy trays, the small notebook she kept in her room, filled with budgeting lists and reminders about medical appointments 2 states away. One afternoon, while Sarah was helping Emily with an art project in the sunroom, Richard walked in unannounced. "What are you two working on?" he asked. Emily held up a crayon drawing. "It's us. Me, Sarah, and you. See." The picture was simple but telling. The 3 of them stood under a tree, smiling. But Sarah was drawn with a crown. Richard blinked. "Why does Sarah have a crown?" "Because she's the hero," Emily said without hesitation. He looked at Sarah, who smiled nervously, clearly unsure of how to respond. "You know," Richard said, taking a seat, "most people think heroes wear capes." "Capes are silly," Emily replied. "Sarah wears sneakers. That's better." They laughed, but Richard's heart was quiet. That night, he stood by the window again, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance. Something had shifted inside him. What had started as suspicion had become something else, an awareness, sharp and impossible to ignore. He couldn't define it yet, but it was there. It was no longer about curiosity. It was about reckoning. And it was just beginning. Richard sat in the backseat of his car as it moved quietly through the winding roads of Pacific Heights. He wasn't headed to a meeting or dinner. He had canceled everything for the day. The folder with Sarah's background lay beside him, opened a photo of a small single-story home in southern Oregon. He kept staring at it, trying to bridge the gap between the quiet woman who lived under his roof and the sacrifices outlined in those printed pages. The car pulled up to a quiet neighborhood in the city, and Richard stepped out alone. He didn't notify Sarah where he was going, nor did he bring anyone with him. He entered a modest building and took the elevator to the 4th floor, where a contact had arranged a meeting with someone who used to know Sarah, an older woman who once managed a daycare, where Sarah had worked before moving to San Francisco. The woman greeted him with surprise, but invited him in without hesitation. "She was one of the best we ever had," the woman said, pouring tea into mismatched cups. "Quiet, kind. The kids loved her. You don't find that often." "Why did she leave?" Richard asked. The woman shrugged. "Her mother got worse. The travel back and forth became too much. She tried to do both for a while, take care of her mom and work here, but it nearly broke her. I think she came to the city because the pay was better. She needed to send money home." She never mentioned any of this. She wouldn't. Sarah was proud, not in an arrogant way, just private. She didn't want sympathy. She just wanted to work and do the right thing. Richard nodded slowly, unsure what to do with the knot forming in his chest. On the way back to the estate, he watched the city flash past his window, the shops, the towering glass buildings, the manicured parks. His world. The world of deals and quarterly results and strategy sessions. A world where nothing was ever given freely, and everything was calculated. He returned home close to sunset. Emily was playing in the backyard with a kite, Sarah standing at a distance, watching her with a faint smile. The wind tugged gently at her hair, and Richard, watching through the glass doors, realized that he had never really looked at her until recently. She had always been there, efficient, polite, silent, but now, with everything he had learned, she looked entirely different, not less familiar, just more complete. That evening, while Emily was upstairs drawing, Richard approached Sarah in the kitchen. She was preparing tea and slicing fruit, the soft rhythm of the knife against the cutting board steady and practiced. "I went out today," he said casually, taking a seat at the counter. She glanced at him. "Oh, I met someone who used to work with you, back in Oregon." She paused. The knife stopped. "I see," she said quietly, then resumed slicing. "She spoke very highly of you, said the children loved you, that you worked hard, that you carried more than your share." Sarah didn't answer. "I also know about your mother," he added gently, "and about why you left school." She placed the knife down and turned to face him, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I didn't think you'd look into me." "I didn't plan to," he admitted. "But after the hospital, after what you did for Emily, I couldn't ignore the fact that I barely knew you." "You didn't need to know," she said, her voice even. "I was hired to do a job. I've done it. You didn't just do a job, Sarah. You saved her. Silence stretched between them. She's my entire world, he added, softer now. And you gave her back to me. I didn't do it for you. I know. That's what makes it harder. She lowered her gaze. I built my life around knowing people's motives, he continued. I can read a room, predict a negotiation, spot when someone's hiding something. But you did something extraordinary and asked for nothing. And now that I know what your life has been like, I just keep thinking, how many times have you sacrificed without anyone noticing? Sarah looked up at him. This isn't about me. But it should be... She stepped back slightly, as if uncomfortable with the weight of his words. I'm not looking for recognition, she said. Or charity. I'm not offering charity. I'm trying to understand. Her jaw tightened slightly. Understanding changes things. And I don't want this job, this life, to become something else because of pity or guilt. It's not pity, Richard said. It's respect. Maybe the first real respect I felt for someone in a long time. That startled her. She blinked, then looked away. I should finish dinner, she murmured. But Richard didn't move. He stayed at the counter long after she left the room, staring at the half-sliced fruit and the quiet hum of the house around him. That night, he opened a new document on his computer. It wasn't a business memo or a legal contract. It was a letter, unsent, unshared, just something he needed to write. He wrote about Emily, about her laugh, her fragile heartbeat, her little hands, about the terror he had felt at the hospital, about the nameless fear that had gripped him when he thought he might lose her. And he wrote about Sarah, not just the act of donating blood, but the life she had led to arrive at that moment, the layers of strength she had wrapped in humility, the dignity she had preserved even when she had every right to ask for more. The letter ended with a single line. Some debts are too human to repay with money. He closed the file and sat in silence. Over the next few days, Richard began making small changes around the house. Not grand gestures, just quiet alterations in behavior. He started spending more time with Emily. He asked Sarah questions, not about her duties, but about her opinions. He offered to help clean up after dinner, something he had never done. Once, he even surprised both of them by joining their evening story session. He read aloud, awkwardly at first, but warmed up as Emily curled beside him. Sarah sitting close, listening quietly. He didn't mention the investigation again. Neither did she, but the air between them shifted. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something approaching it. For the next few weeks, life inside the Callahan estate settled into a quiet rhythm. But beneath the surface, everything had subtly changed. The balance had shifted. Richard, once emotionally distant and absorbed by work, found himself watching more than speaking, listening more than directing. He became aware of spaces in the house he had never truly seen before. The library nook where Emily often napped beside Sarah, the small shelf in the hallway where Sarah had started leaving post-it notes with reminders for herself, and the kitchen radio that always played softly in the mornings. Classical music, gentle and unintrusive. He started paying attention to details he used to overlook, noticing when Sarah was tired, when her hands were red from the cold water at the sink, or when her eyes lingered just a second longer on the family photos she was never part of. Her presence was still quiet, but now, to Richard, it had weight, it had depth, and yet, despite the softening of his perspective, he couldn't ignore the discomfort growing within him. It wasn't Sarah's fault. It was the realization of how wide the gulf between their worlds really was. He had spent most of his life on the elevated side of that divide. Penthouses, boardrooms, private jets, gala dinners. The world Sarah came from was one he hadn't visited in decades. Grocery coupons, unreliable public transportation, unpaid utility bills, and long nights juggling responsibilities no one else noticed. A world built not on opportunity, but endurance. That awareness created something Richard wasn't used to carrying: guilt. One afternoon, Richard returned early from a brief investor lunch and found Sarah in the backyard, sitting on the steps of the patio with a cup of tea. She didn't hear him approach. Emily was inside watching a movie, the volume low. "You ever take a moment for yourself?" he asked, his voice casual. Sarah looked up, surprised but not startled. Every now and then, he joined her, sitting down with a sigh that sounded heavier than intended. "Does it ever feel strange?" he asked after a moment. She turned to him, puzzled. "What does this?" He gestured loosely at the garden, the house behind them, the manicured world that wasn't hers. Sarah considered the question for a moment. "Not strange. Just not mine. You've been here nearly a year." "I know, but it still feels like you're just visiting." She nodded. "It's like staying in a museum. Beautiful, quiet, but you know not to touch anything too hard." He didn't know what to say. The silence between them wasn't awkward, just honest. "I want you to feel at home," he said eventually. Sarah smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You can't give someone that, Richard. Home isn't a room or a paycheck. It's in freedom, choice, safety." She stood, cup in hand. "But thank you." That night, he sat alone in the dining room after Emily and Sarah had gone to bed, the silence of the house pressing around him, no longer comforting. He stared at the untouched glass of wine in front of him and felt something he hadn't in years. Uselessness. Not because he lacked power, but because none of that power could bridge the distance between them. Between the man who owned the estate and the woman who slept in the smallest room down the hall. Between the man who wrote off six-figure expenses without blinking and the woman who calculated groceries to the dollar. The next morning, he called his legal advisor. "I want to explore some changes," he said. "Private ones. Discreet." "What kind of changes?" "Long-term financial planning. Asset reassignment. Possibly creating an educational trust. And I'll need everything structured in a way that's difficult to trace publicly." The lawyer paused. "Is this about your daughter?" "Yes, and someone important to her." "Understood. I'll begin drafting proposals." "But Richard," this will raise questions. "Then answer them with discretion." When the call ended, Richard stood by the window, watching as Sarah walked Emily to the car for school drop-off. The two of them were laughing about something, the kind of carefree moment he couldn't engineer. Sarah leaned down to tie Emily's shoelace, and in that simple act, Richard saw something more meaningful than all the philanthropy pledges he had signed. He knew she would resist help if he offered it outright. Pride wasn't something you could negotiate. But maybe, just maybe, he could create something she couldn't reject. Not because she accepted charity, but because she accepted justice. The following day, he invited Sarah to his study. She looked hesitant when she entered, clearly unsure what the meeting was about. He gestured for her to sit. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, "about your future." Sarah tensed immediately. "Am I being let go?" "No. God, no." He shook his head. "That's not what this is. Quite the opposite." She remained silent, guarded. "I know you've made sacrifices," he continued. "For your mother, for work, for Emily. And I also know you've never asked for anything in return." "I haven't expected anything either," she said. "I know. That's exactly why I want to offer something now. Not out of obligation, not even gratitude, but because it's the right thing to do." "What are you offering?" He took a deep breath. "A full scholarship fund. Any university, any program. Complete coverage. And medical support for your mother through a private care service. I've already initiated the contacts in Oregon, and I'd like to make you a partner in one of my upcoming ventures. Silent stake. You wouldn't need to change anything about your life unless you wanted to." Sarah stared at him, speechless. "I don't want you to think of this as a favor," he said gently. "It's not. This is long overdue recognition for what you've done, not just for Emily, but for me. You reminded me what humanity looks like." Her throat tightened. "Why now?" "Because I finally opened my eyes." Sarah's hands were trembling. She looked down at them, tried to steady her voice. "I don't know if I can accept this." "Think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking. Take a few days. No pressure." She nodded slowly, then stood. Her eyes were glassy, but no tears fell. Not yet. As she left the room, Richard felt a tension in his chest begin to ease. But it was only the beginning of a shift neither of them fully understood yet. What stood between them now wasn't silence. It was a slow dismantling of a wall neither of them had built intentionally, but both were ready to tear down. 2 days after their conversation in the study, Sarah had still not given Richard an answer. She remained polite, professional, and warm with Emily, but her interactions with him had become more reserved. Not cold, not distant, just measured, as if she were carefully weighing something heavy inside her and didn't yet know where it would land. Richard noticed a change immediately, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to close the distance. It was a negotiation, and there was no contract he could draft to fix it. So he waited, but waiting only heightened the urgency inside him, not for a response. He knew better than to pressure her, but for understanding. If she was hesitating, it wasn't out of greed or doubt. It was something deeper, something she hadn't said, and Richard needed to know what it was. That evening, after Emily had gone to sleep, Richard sat alone in his private office and opened the envelope left by the investigator he had hired weeks earlier. He had read the surface-level information already, her education, employment history, basic family details. But there was an additional section he hadn't yet explored. He had asked for it and then chosen not to open it. Until now, he unsealed the page and began to read. What emerged was a portrait of a life far more difficult than he had anticipated. The file detailed the months after Sarah dropped out of college. Her mother's illness had progressed rapidly. Sarah had moved home, balancing caregiving with late-night shifts at a 24-hour convenience store. During the harshest winter in Portland's recent history, she went without heat in the apartment for several weeks, unable to afford both medication and gas. She had applied for over a dozen grants and scholarships, all of which were denied, not for lack of merit, but because she was classified as incomplete due to her break in academic continuity. With mounting debt and a failing support system, Sarah took a job as a house cleaner, not for money, but because the elderly woman she cleaned for allowed her to use the laundry room and occasionally sent her home with leftovers. Richard paused as he read this. The image of Sarah, the composed, intelligent, capable woman he now saw every day, scrubbing someone else's floors and living off donated casseroles. It didn't match with the way she carried herself now, but that, he realized, was part of the point. She never let the weight of her past show. She never let anyone see how much she had carried alone. Further down the report, there was an entry that stopped him cold, a court filing, a petition Sarah had submitted requesting financial guardianship over her mother when the illness began affecting her decision-making abilities. The motion had been approved. Sarah had been managing her mother's life, legal, financial, and medical, since the age of 23. He leaned back in his chair, stunned, not because he doubted her strength, but because he had never met anyone who had survived so much with so little recognition. The following day, Richard drove to the city himself. He needed to speak with someone, not a lawyer or an advisor, but someone who had known Sarah before she became the woman working in his home. The address was a modest nursing home tucked behind a church in a quiet suburb just outside Portland. Her mother wasn't there. She was still being cared for at home, but the manager, a woman named Lillian who had worked briefly with Sarah on a temporary support program, welcomed him in. She was with us for 6 months, Lillian explained as they sat by a window overlooking the back garden. Came in as a night caregiver. Quiet, competent, but you could tell she was running on fumes. Did she ever ask for help? Lillian shook her head. That's the thing. She never asked for anything. Not time off. Not emotional support. I remember one night, she came in soaking wet from the rain. Didn't say a word. Just changed into dry scrubs and started her rounds. Did anyone try to help her? We did what we could, but she wasn't easy to reach. I think she had built her life around not needing anyone. Richard nodded, more to himself than to Lillian. As he left, he stopped beside a bulletin board by the front entrance. There, pinned among holiday schedules and staff photos, was a worn-out flyer from 5 years ago, an old volunteer call for a community health drive. And at the bottom, in faint handwriting, the name Sarah Green. He drove back in silence. That evening, when Sarah returned from the grocery store, she found Richard in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, chopping vegetables awkwardly. She blinked, surprised. "Are you cooking?" "I'm trying," he said. Emily requested homemade soup. and I figured I could learn something new. Sarah smiled faintly and set the groceries down. You want to dice those smaller, or they'll cook unevenly. I was hoping you'd say that. They cooked together in near silence, the kind that wasn't awkward but shared, comfortable. Finally, as the soup simmered, Richard turned to her. I know more now, he said, about what you've been through, what you're still going through. She stiffened. I wasn't spying to invade your privacy. I just needed to understand why someone would refuse help that's not just deserved, but earned. Her jaw tightened slightly. Because when you accept help, people start thinking they own parts of you. I don't want to own anything, he said. Not your loyalty, not your future. I just want to be someone who didn't ignore the truth once he finally saw it. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Truth doesn't change anything, she said eventually. I disagree, he replied. It changes everything. She met his gaze, and for the first time, something shifted. Not surrender, not full trust, but recognition. That he wasn't just throwing money at a problem, that he had looked into the deepest parts of her story and hadn't flinched. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Sarah knocked softly on his study door. I've thought about what you offered, she said. He put his book down, and I'm not ready to accept everything. But if the offer still stands, I'd like to start with the medical care for my mother. It absolutely stands. And maybe, she added, I'll think about school later. Richard nodded, one step at a time. She turned to go, but then paused. Thank you. Not for charity, he said. No, she agreed. For seeing me. And then she was gone. But for the first time, Richard felt like something invisible had cracked open. A door, maybe, into the world she kept locked away for years. And for once, he wasn't standing outside it. The shift between Sarah and Richard was subtle but unmistakable. After she accepted the first part of his offer, the medical care for her mother, she seemed a little less guarded, though still cautious. She didn't move differently or speak with any more confidence than before, but her eyes no longer dropped immediately when Richard entered the room. There was something new in her presence, something closer to balance. And yet, behind his composed exterior, Richard was far from calm. What Sarah had accepted was only a fraction of what he wanted to do for her. She had given him permission to intervene in one specific corner of her life, but the rest remained untouched, off limits. He respected that, but it didn't stop him from planning more. Late at night, after Emily was asleep and the house had fallen into silence, Richard began spending more time alone in his study, not reviewing business reports or drafting shareholder memos, but something far more personal. He had made it clear that what he intended for Sarah wasn't charity, and he meant it. He didn't want to simply ease her burdens. He wanted to build a structure beneath her life strong enough to carry her forward, far beyond the confines of his household. He began drafting a proposal, one that would establish Sarah as a silent partner in a new tech venture his company was preparing to launch. The project itself was low risk, low profile, designed for community infrastructure and educational systems. Precisely the kind of thing that rarely attracted headlines but had the potential for long-term stability and slow growth. It was perfect. She would be listed as a founding stakeholder, her portion held in trust, untraceable through public filings. It would take years to mature, but when it did, it would give her options. To go back to school, to move, to start something of her own, without asking, without permission, without needing anyone's help. But Sarah couldn't know about it. Not yet. If he approached her too soon, she would likely decline out of principle. So he began making calls. Lawyers, advisors, trust managers. Each meeting was kept quiet, off the books, scheduled between regular business operations to avoid attention. Documents were encrypted, signed in secure digital rooms, and backed with non-disclosure clauses. Even his closest staff didn't know what the sudden burst of evening meetings was about. His assistant speculated a private acquisition. His head of finance assumed he was preparing for a quiet exit from one of his public holdings. Only Richard knew the truth. It wasn't about business. It was about rebuilding a life that wasn't his to rebuild, but that he could support discreetly with care. One evening, while reviewing final draft of the stake agreement, he paused at the signature line, Sarah Elaine Green. It looked ordinary, but to him, it symbolized something much greater. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of the dimly lit room. There was a restlessness inside him that had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with humility. For the first time in years, he wasn't building something for himself. Not for prestige, not for profit. It felt strange. It felt right. Elsewhere in the house, Sarah had noticed his distance. Not coldness, just a certain withdrawal. He was less talkative during breakfast, more occupied during the evenings. She caught him once, standing at the foot of the stairs with a strange look in his eyes, focused, contemplative, like he was solving a puzzle no one else could see. She tried not to read into it. It wasn't her place. Their moment of closeness had passed, and though there was no tension between them, she sensed that something had shifted again, this time on his side. He wasn't angry or dismissive, but he was clearly holding something back. On a rainy Thursday morning, Emily approached her father with a handmade card. "You should give this to Sarah," she said, pushing the crayon-covered envelope into his hand. "What is it?" "A thank you card. You told me we say thank you when someone makes things better." Richard looked down at the drawing. 3 figures holding hands under a sun, with a giant heart above their heads. "She helped you," Emily said. "So now you help her." Richard knelt beside his daughter. "That's exactly what I'm trying to do." "Then don't wait too long," she added, her voice unusually serious for a 7-year-old. That night, Richard returned to his study and finalized the last piece of the plan. He scheduled a private meeting with his legal team for following Monday. The terms were ready. All that remained was to make sure everything was watertight, anonymous, protected, and secure. Sarah would have no obligations, no pressure, and full access when the time was right. But then something unexpected happened. As he was shutting down his laptop, a knock came at his study door. It was Sarah. "Am I interrupting?" she asked. He gestured for her to come in. "Not at all. I could use a break." She walked in, arms crossed lightly in front of her. There was an unease in her eyes that caught his attention immediately. "I wanted to ask you something," she said, "and it's a little difficult." Richard closed his laptop and gave her his full attention. "My mom's condition has stabilized," she began, "but the care provider said we might need to upgrade her treatment plan in a few months. Something more sustainable. I know I said I'd only accept the basics, but I might need help adjusting the plan later on." "You don't need to explain," Richard said. "I'll make sure the transition is covered. Whatever she needs, it's done." Sarah nodded slowly. "Thank you." She turned to leave, then hesitated at the door. "I've been thinking about something else, too." He waited. "You said this isn't charity, that this is something you do because it's right." "I meant it." "I believe you," she said, "but it's still hard to accept. I spent so many years learning not to expect anything from anyone, so many years thinking that needing help made me weaker. It doesn't go away overnight. I don't expect it to." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Then why are you doing all this?" Richard stood and walked around the desk, leaning against it, arms crossed. "Because I was raised by someone who gave everything and got nothing back," he said. "Because I forgot what that looked like until I saw it again in you. And because I'm tired of living in a world where people like you go unnoticed." Sarah's eyes dropped to the floor. "I see more than you think," he added. "And I don't want to fix you. I just want to give you the space to keep being who you already are without all the weight." She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Okay." Then she left, leaving behind a silence that was no longer heavy, but full of something else. Possibility. The rain came unexpectedly, soaking the city in a quiet melancholy that mirrored Richard's internal state. It was a rare Sunday when he had cleared his schedule entirely. No calls, no emails, no obligations. But instead of using the time to relax, he found himself walking aimlessly through the older parts of the city, neighborhoods that hadn't changed much in 30 years. He turned down a street that looked almost identical to the one he'd grown up on. Modest apartment buildings, cracked sidewalks, rusted fences, and tired trees still trying to reach the sky. He hadn't visited that world in a long time. not out of shame, but because it simply hadn't fit into the life he built afterward. The climb had been steep and unforgiving, and once he reached the summit, he'd never looked back. Until now, the scent of wet concrete triggered memories he hadn't touched in decades. His mother's late-night returns from work, the way she'd sit silently at the kitchen table sipping cold tea, exhaustion in her eyes but never in her presence. She had worked 3 jobs for most of his childhood: cleaning offices, waiting tables, babysitting other people's children, while barely managing to care for her own. Richard stopped in front of an old diner, the kind with flickering neon signs and faded stools. He stepped inside, not because he was hungry, but because it looked exactly like the one she used to take him to on her rare nights off when they could afford a shared slice of pie. He sat in the corner booth and ordered coffee, staring out the rain-streaked window, not seeing the present but the past layered on top of it. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Never forget where you came from, Ricky, not because you owe anyone, but because your feet know the ground that raised you." He hadn't understood that when he was younger. He thought it was about guilt, about being tethered to struggle. But now, as he watched droplets race down the glass, he realized it was about memory, about respect, about not losing the humanity that ambition tries so hard to bury. Back at the estate, Sarah was reading with Emily in her room. The girl was sprawled on the floor, coloring while Sarah recited the words from a book she already knew by heart. It was a peaceful moment, one of many they had shared in recent weeks, but tonight, Sarah's voice had a different cadence. Her mind kept drifting. She had noticed the way Richard had withdrawn again, though not out of avoidance. It was something else, a kind of reflection she had never seen in him before, like he was facing something internally that even he didn't know how to name. When Emily drifted off to sleep, Sarah stood quietly, tucking the blanket around her and brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. She closed the door behind her and lingered in the hallway for a moment, wondering if she should check to see if Richard had come home. Instead, she walked downstairs and stood by the large front window, looking out into the rain. Richard didn't return until nearly midnight. When he entered, Sarah was still awake, sitting on the edge of the living room couch with a cup of tea in her hands. "You're up late," he said, surprised. "I could say the same to you." He gave a tired smile and stepped out of his shoes. His clothes were damp, and there was something disheveled about his usually pristine appearance. He looked more human than he ever had. "I went for a walk," he said. "In this weather? I needed to think. And remember," she raised an eyebrow but said nothing, inviting him to continue. "I went back to the old neighborhood," he said, walking slowly into the room and lowering himself into the chair opposite her, "where I grew up." Sarah's expression softened. "My mother," he continued, "worked herself to the bone to make sure I had a shot. She used to come home at midnight, covered in sweat from cleaning buildings she could never afford to work in. I hated it, not because I was ashamed, but because it made me feel helpless." He paused and looked up. "I think that's why I buried it. I spent so long building something so far away from that world that I forgot it existed. Or maybe I want to pretend it didn't." Sarah didn't interrupt. "And then you walked into my house, and you lived under my roof with the same quiet strength my mother had, never asking, never complaining, just showing up every day, holding the pieces together." His voice grew quieter. "I didn't see it. I didn't recognize it. Not until you gave something I didn't even know I needed." The room fell into silence. The rain tapped gently against the windows, steady and constant. Sarah finally spoke. "You don't have to apologize." "I'm not," he said. "I'm grateful, but I also feel ashamed. Not because I failed you, but because I forgot someone like you even existed. I got so used to people taking, scheming, wanting, and then there you were, giving." She held his gaze. "You said once that seeing people like me reminded you of what humanity looks like. But, Richard, we're not that different." He tilted his head. "I'm not a symbol," she said. "I'm a person. I get scared. I get tired. I make mistakes. And sometimes I wonder if I'm making the right choices. But I keep going because I don't know how to stop." "That's exactly what I mean," he said. "That strength." "It's not strength," she whispered. "It's survival. He nodded slowly, understanding more in that moment than he ever had. Then, without another word, he stood and walked to the nearby bookshelf. From the top, he pulled a thin leather-bound notebook. He handed it to her. She opened it and found sketches of a nonprofit concept, early ideas, scribbled mission statements, potential names. The title across the top read, The Green Foundation. She looked up, startled. "I had this drafted for something I was thinking of funding," he said. "But now, I want it to be yours. A Rayoff Foundation. For caregivers. For women who are holding the world together quietly. Like you, we can build it together. You'd run it. I'd fund it. And we'd change lives." Sarah blinked. This is too much." "No," he said, stepping closer. "This is exactly enough." The rain continued to fall, but inside the room, a quiet warmth began to take hold, a recognition, a respect, and the first breath of something that felt like healing. The sun shone brighter than usual the morning of the Callahan family gathering. The estate buzzed with preparations. Caterers unloading supplies, decorators arranging flowers along the terrace, and the sound of staff moving swiftly through the house. Richard had hosted dozens of events in his lifetime, but none had carried the weight of intention this one did. It was not a celebration, not a press stunt. It was, for him, an inflection point. Sarah kept herself in the background as the preparations unfolded. She knew about the gathering, but hadn't been told its purpose. All Richard had said was that he wanted everyone close to the family present. Business partners, close friends, even a few board members were expected. The guest list was impressive, but it was a sealed envelope waiting in Richard's study that defined the day's real purpose. He spent the morning reviewing every detail. Inside the envelope were 3 documents, one confirming Sarah's equity stake in the new tech venture, already legally transferred to her name, another outlining the full tuition plan, open-ended and unrestricted, and the final one, a signed letter of intent for Green Foundation, with her listed as executive director, should she choose to accept. Each document had been crafted with precision, discretion, and the quiet hope that she would not just accept the help, but embrace the life that came with it. The guests began to arrive shortly after noon. Richard moved among them with his usual ease, nodding through conversations about market trends and international ventures. But his eyes wandered constantly toward the inner corridor, toward the part of the house Sarah and Emily occupied. Sarah, for a part, remained professional throughout the event. She kept Emily entertained in the garden, occasionally checking in with the staff to make sure everything ran smoothly. But she felt the shift in the air, the attention, the subtle glances. There was something unsaid traveling to the crowd like static, just after the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the terrace. Richard took the stage near the fountain to make his speech. It was customary at these events, a few words of thanks, an anecdote, a toast. But this time it would be different. "I've spent most of my life building things," he began, his voice steady. "Companies, products, systems. But recently, I was reminded that the most important structures aren't built in boardrooms or funded through capital. They're built in quiet moments, in kitchens, in hospital rooms, in the hearts of those who give more than they take." The audience quieted. "Someone once told me that strength isn't about what you control. It's about what you carry when no one else is looking. And I've had the honor of witnessing that kind of strength up close." He paused, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on Sarah, standing just inside the doorway, holding Emily's hand. "There is someone here today who changed my life, not by demanding attention, but by showing up when it mattered most. She saved my daughter's life. She reminded me who I used to be. And without asking for anything, she gave me everything." A ripple of murmurs spread through the guests. "Sarah," he said, voice lowering with sincerity, "would you stay for a moment after the gathering?" Sarah froze. He gave a small nod, then returned to the crowd and raised his glass. "To those who carry quietly." The event continued as expected. Champagne flowed, conversations resumed, but something had shifted. Sarah could feel the eyes on her, could feel the undercurrent of curiosity and speculation, but she didn't move. Emily tugged her hand gently and said nothing. Somehow, she understood, After the last guest had trickled out and the staff began to clean up, Sarah walked slowly toward Richard's study. The door was slightly ajar. He was waiting inside, standing by the fireplace, the envelope in his hands. "You wanted to see me?" she asked softly. He nodded and motioned for her to sit. She didn't. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. "I already did that outside. But I do want to show you something." He handed her the envelope. She looked at it for a long time before opening it. The documents were clear, concise, and unmistakably generous. Sarah scanned each one, slowly, carefully, as if afraid to believe they were real. Her eyes stopped on the foundation letter, her name typed neatly at the top of the page. "This isn't a proposal," she said, her voice tight. "It's already done." "Yes," Richard said, "but nothing activates unless you agree. No pressure, no obligation." She sat down. "This is too much." "No," he said firmly. "This is fair." She looked up at him, eyes searching. "Why are you really doing this?" "Because," he said quietly, "you gave without expectation, and that kind of giving doesn't belong in the shadows." Sarah didn't speak. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the documents back into the envelope. "I'm not used to being seen," she whispered. "You've been seen," Richard said, "just not by the right people. Until now." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Sarah stood, envelope pressed to her chest. "I need time," she said. "Take it." She turned to leave, then paused. "If I accept this, everything changes." "I hope so," he replied. She nodded once and slipped out of the room, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. Richard remained where he was, staring into the fireplace. He knew what he had done was bold, unorthodox, even risky. But for once in his life, it didn't feel like a gamble. It felt like the most honest decision he had ever made. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere down the hall, Sarah sat alone with the envelope in her lap, the weight of possibility pressing against her chest like gravity. And though she hadn't said it aloud, part of her already knew the answer. The news leaked less than 48 hours after the gathering. It began as a whisper in a business gossip column, a subtle line buried deep in an article about philanthropic shifts in Silicon Valley. Sources suggest Richard Callahan has named a former domestic staff member as a beneficiary in a private tech venture and educational trust. By the end of the week, it was a headline: "Tech tycoon funds Nanny's future. Genius or PR gamble?" The media swarmed with speculation. The story was too irresistible. A billionaire giving a massive financial stake, tuition, and an entire foundation to a woman previously unknown to the public. The headlines ranged from curious to cynical. Some praised Richard's generosity. Others questioned his motives. A few outright mocked him. Is Richard Callahan the new Messiah of merit? Benevolence or branding? Why one man's kindness is raising eyebrows on Wall Street. And as expected, the investors responded. During a quarterly board meeting, the tension was palpable. Richard sat at the head of the long, polished table while 10 directors stared back at him, their expressions controlled but unreadable. Gordon Wells, the oldest and most additional among them, leaned forward. "Richard," he began, tone calm but deliberate, "you've always operated with a certain autonomy. That's part of what made this company what it is. But this decision, this highly visible, unconventional decision, has created ripple effects we can't ignore." Richard didn't flinch. "I understand the optics." "Do you?" Gordon asked. "You gave equity, real ownership, to someone outside the executive structure. No advisory role, no tech background, no corporate ladder. It's unprecedented. She earned it in a way most people never will." Another board member, a younger woman named Priya, spoke next. "No one questions your right to use personal funds or build private initiatives. But it crossed over, Richard. It touched our brand, our stakeholders. And the media has made Sarah the symbol of it all. That was never the intention." "Maybe not," she said, "but it's done." After the meeting adjourned, his assistant informed him that 2 major investors had requested reassurances about governance. One even hinted at the need for clearer professional boundaries in future partnerships. Richard didn't react. He expected this. What he didn't expect was the impact it would have on Sarah. That evening, she found herself at the center of a storm she never asked for. The news had reached her mother's care facility. Nurses congratulated her. Neighbors called. Former co-workers reached out through email. Her phone buzzed constantly, and her inbox overflowed with messages, some admiring, others suspicious, and a few downright cruel. She tried to keep Emily shielded from it, but even the little girl sensed attention. During bedtime, Emily looked up at Sarah and asked, "Did you do something bad?" "No," Sarah whispered. But people don't always understand when something good happens for the right reasons. The next morning, she stood in the kitchen with the envelope still in her bag, untouched since that night. She hadn't given her formal answer yet. Now, it felt more complicated than ever. Richard entered, coffee in hand. "They've dragged you into this," she said flatly. "I know. You said it would be private. I never expected it to leak. You're a public figure. You should have." He looked at her, seeing the exhaustion on her face. "I can shut it down," he said. "Withdraw the documents. Undo the agreements. If it protects you, I'll do it." Her eyes met his. "That's not the point. The damage is done. People think I asked for this, that I manipulated you. They're wrong. That doesn't matter." He stepped closer. "What does matter?" She exhaled, voice tight. "That I've worked my whole life to stand on my own, and now people think I was carried. You weren't. You walked through fire. I just finally noticed. But they won't believe that, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life defending something that was meant to be sacred." He fell silent. Later that day, Sarah took a walk to the city alone, wrapped in a coat and scarf, avoiding eye contact, trying to disappear. But the headlines were everywhere, on screens in cafes, in murmurs on buses, even in the glances of strangers who wondered if the woman beside them was at Sarah Green. By the time she returned, her mind was racing. She found Richard in his study, reading through messages from his PR team. "I'm stepping back," she said. He looked up. "What?" "I can't be the face of this. Not like this. The foundation, the venture, it's all tainted now. They've turned it into something it was never meant to be. Then we'll fix it." "No," she said. "You can't fix perception. And I won't be a tool in a media cycle. I never asked you to be. But they've made me one. And whether you like it or not, you become part of the story too. They think you're hiding something, that you're trying to repair your image. And the more you push back, the more they'll dig." Richard stood slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. "So what do you want?" he asked. "Distance," she said. "I need to reclaim the space that's mine. I need to prove to them, to myself, that I'm not a shadow of your generosity." He stepped back, nodding slowly, his expression unreadable. "I never meant to put you in this position," he said. "Everything I did out of respect." "I know," she said quietly, "but now I have to do something for myself." They stood in silence for a moment before she turned to leave. Outside, the world spun with noise, voices, headlines, speculation. But inside the estate, all that remained between them was a sharp echo of a good deed misunderstood. For the first time since she had entered the Callahan household, Sarah began to withdraw. Her routines remained steady. Breakfast prepared at the same time, Emily's school drop-offs and pickups, her quiet steps through the halls. But there was a new stillness to her movements, like someone living in a place they no longer consider home. Conversations with Richard became brief, purely functional. She declined invitations to family dinners and spent most of her evenings alone in her room, the envelope he had given her now hidden away in the back of a drawer. Richard noticed the change immediately, and though he respected her space, the silence weighed on him. He had done what he believed was right, but in the aftermath, everything he valued most, Emily's ease, Sarah's trust, the quiet unity they had shared, had begun to splinter. His advisors urged him to control the narrative. One suggested hiring a media consultant to redirect the story. Another encouraged a press release emphasizing Sarah's qualifications and the Foundation's mission. But Richard refused. He wasn't interested in fighting fire with fire. This wasn't a campaign. It was a wound, and wounds didn't heal through spin. What he hadn't anticipated, however, was Emily's response. The girl had remained cheerful on the surface, but in the days following Sarah's retreat, she began showing signs of unease. She asked more questions. Why was Sarah sad? Why didn't she eat dinner with them anymore? Why were people saying mean things online? Richard tried to shield her from a media storm. But even at 7 years old, Emily sensed the emotional current flowing beneath the surface. One evening, as he tucked her into bed, she looked up at him with wide, worried eyes. "Is Sarah leaving?" she asked. "I don't know," Richard admitted. "Did you make her sad?" The question hit him harder than he expected. "I didn't mean to," he said quietly. Emily was silent for a moment, then whispered, "If she goes, I'll be sad too." After she fell asleep, Richard stood by her door for a long time, listening to the sound of her breathing. The walls felt thinner now, fragile, like everything he had built inside this house. This family was one strong gust away from falling apart. The next morning, he called Sarah into the sunroom. She entered hesitantly, arms crossed, expecting another difficult conversation. "Emily's been asking questions," he said, not unkindly. "She misses you." "I'm still here," Sarah replied. "You're not," he said gently. "Not in the same way." Sarah looked down. "I made a decision for you," he continued. "And even if my intentions were good, I didn't ask how you'd feel about being placed in the spotlight. That wasn't fair." "It's not about fairness," she replied. "It's about being seen in a way I didn't choose." He nodded. "I can't undo what's been said," he said, "but I can change how we respond." "How?" Before he could answer, a knock interrupted them. It was one of the household staff, holding a package. "This came from Miss Green," the woman said, handing Sarah a thick, official-looking envelope. Sarah opened it slowly. Inside was an invitation, elegant handwritten, for a small community press event organized by a local nonprofit. The organization had learned about her story and wanted to honor her alongside other women who had made quiet contributions to children's lives. The message was simple. "We believe in the power of unrecognized courage." She read the card twice before saying anything. "I didn't sign up for this," she murmured. "I know," Richard said, "but maybe it's time you stop hiding." She looked up at him, uncertain. "That doesn't mean you owe the world your story," he added. "But it does mean you get to decide how it's told." That night, she thought deeply about the envelope, about the foundation, about Emily, about what it meant to be dragged into the light against your will, and then handed a microphone when the world had already made up its mind. The next day, Sarah surprised everyone. She accepted the invitation. The event was small, held in the community center of a neighborhood far from the tech towers and gated estates. The room was filled with teachers, social workers, and caregivers, many of whom had never been in the news and never would be. Sarah wore a simple navy dress. No makeup, no entourage, just herself. Richard sat quietly in the audience with Emily beside him, unnoticed by most. When Sarah was called to the stage, the applause was warm, not thunderous, but genuine. She stepped up to the microphone with visible nerves. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "I didn't want to be here," she said. "Not because I'm ungrateful, but because I did believe I belonged." She paused, scanning the room. "When the story about me leaked, people started defining me by someone else's decision. They called me lucky, strategic, opportunistic. But the truth is, I was just doing what I've always done, quietly caring. That doesn't make me extraordinary. It makes me human." A few heads nodded. "I didn't save anyone to be thanked. And I didn't step back because I was ashamed. I stepped back because sometimes the noise of praise can feel like pressure, especially when it's not on your terms." She looked directly at Richard. "But someone reminded me that silence isn't the only way to keep your dignity. Sometimes, speaking your truth is the most respectful thing you can do for yourself and for those who see you as more than the headlines." The room was quiet as she stepped down. Then applause erupted, this time louder, filled with something heavier than approval. Recognition. Emily jumped into Sarah's arms the moment she reached the floor. "You were so good," she whispered. Richard approached them, his voice low and steady. "You didn't just take control of the story," he said. "You rewrote it." Sarah met his gaze. "It was never your story to tell." "I know," he said. "I'm just grateful to witness the one you're telling now." As they left the community center, the first photo of Sarah that mattered was taken. Not by paparazzi, not for tabloids, but by a volunteer photographer capturing the faces of local heroes. And in that frame, Sarah wasn't a symbol of generosity or a footnote in a billionaire's redemption arc. She was herself, seen, heard, respected, and no longer in the shadows. Spring arrived with a quiet warmth that seemed to settle into everything. The trees lining the Callahan estate, the laughter echoing from Emily's bedroom, the long walk Sarah took in the early mornings before the rest of the world stirred. It had been nearly 8 months since the first headline, 7 since she stepped away from the public speculation, and 6 since she took the microphone and began rewriting her own story. What followed wasn't fame, but something deeper, purpose. The Green Foundation launched in silence, without press, without ceremony. Sarah insisted on starting it quietly, building from the ground up with a focus on caregivers, single mothers, and underpaid domestic workers. Women who, like her, had existed behind the scenes for too long. The foundation provided legal aid, scholarship support, and emergency housing assistance across 4 states. Its reach wasn't loud, but it was growing, and Sarah, now officially executive director, had changed too. She had returned to school in the evenings, attending a local college part-time with plans to finish her degree in social work. She managed her time carefully, still living at the estate while transitioning out her role as nanny. A new caregiver had been hired, one that Sarah helped train, though Emily insisted on calling her the helper because, in her mind, there was only one true nanny. Emily had taken the change with surprising grace. Perhaps it was a natural resilience of children, or perhaps it was Sarah's gentle way of staying close without overstepping. She still read bedtime stories, still packed lunchboxes, still walked Emily to the car on school mornings. But now, she was doing those things from a place of autonomy, not obligation. One bright Saturday morning, Sarah crossed the stage in a cap and gown, clutching her diploma. The ceremony was modest, hosted at the college's community amphitheater, but the front row felt like something out of a film. Richard sat beside Emily, both of them beaming. Emily held a bouquet that nearly dwarfed her in size, determined to hand it to Sarah herself the moment the ceremony ended. When Sarah's name was called, the applause was steady. Some from strangers who now recognized her name from the foundation, some from peers who had watched her juggle coursework with full-time responsibility, and some from those who simply admired the woman she had become. After the ceremony, amid the crowd of students and families, Sarah walked toward Richard and Emily. The girl ran to her first, arms flung wide, bouquet nearly forgotten. "I told everyone you were the smartest," Emily said proudly. "You did?" Sarah asked, crouching down. "Yes, and the nicest, and the bravest." Sarah smiled, tears quietly threatening the edges of her eyes. Richard stepped forward next, holding out his hand, but Sarah didn't shake it. She hugged him instead. "Thank you," she said softly. "You earned all of this," he replied. They stood like that for a moment. 2 people forever changed by a moment neither had planned, both shaped by sacrifice, and both finally standing as equals. In the weeks that followed, the foundation gained traction. Richard remained involved behind the scenes, never as the face of it, always as a quiet investor and advisor when asked. Their professional relationship was defined by respect, not imbalance. Decisions were made by Sarah and her growing team of women with lived experience. The organization's slogan became a quiet mantra, for those who carry quietly. Sarah moved out of the Callahan estate in early summer, into a small home not far from the city, with a front porch and a garden she planned to fill with herbs and lavender. The transition was bittersweet, especially for Emily, but Sarah promised to visit often, and she did. One afternoon, Richard arrived unannounced at her new home, holding a small box. "I thought you might want this," he said, handing it to her. Inside was a photo, a print of the image taken at the community event so many months ago. It showed Sarah, holding Emily, both smiling. But what made it special was the frame. It was handmade, crafted from what salvage from the old swing set Emily had outgrown. "You saved it," Sarah said, surprised. "It felt wrong to throw it away," Richard replied. "Too many memories." She ran a finger along the grain of the wood. "I think I finally understand what you meant," she said, "when you said some debts are too human to repay with money." He smiled. "You were never in my debt, Sarah." She looked at him, eyes clear. "And you were never in mine." Their bond no longer needed definition. It was an employer and employee. It wasn't a story of wealth and rescue. It was something forged through quiet actions, mutual respect, and choices made not in desperation, but in hope. Months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Sarah stood before a packed room at the first official Green Foundation conference. Hundreds of women, caregivers, social workers, community leaders, filled the auditorium. She wore a simple blazer, her notes neatly folded. But when she stepped up to the podium, she didn't need them. She spoke from memory, about invisible labor, about the courage it took to care for others in silence, about the moments of transformation that arrived not with grand gestures, but with small acts of recognition. And when she finished, she looked out across the room and saw Richard and Emily sitting together, just as they had that day at graduation. Their lives had changed, not through miracles, not through wealth, but through the decision to honor a sacrifice and to build something from it that neither of them could have imagined alone.